Dino Costa is on your radio. Now,
Dino Costa.
It's Friday across North America and around the world. And you're listening to the worldwide Dino Costa radio experience on Sirius XM's Mad Dog Radio.
All right, let's not waste any time. Get right back into it with Daniel J. Flynn, the War on Football Saving America's Game, second hour. You want to get on board and join the conversation, you can. 888-MAD-DOG-6, 888-623-3646. I know the book has just been released this week. Dan, you could have pre-ordered it many weeks ago on Amazon. In fact, I urged people to do that throughout the last couple of weeks leading up to our conversation here today. But I'm wondering if there have been any initial observations or if there has been any kind of a reaction to your book of any significant note by anyone, whether it's a positive or negative.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I've gotten a lot of play in some of the bigger papers. I was able to write an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times. I wrote one in the Chicago Tribune, and I wrote one in the New York Post just last Sunday. So I think a lot of the media has been hearing it from one side, and some of the more fair-minded people in the press realized that, no one really has been speaking out in favor of football. And so they were, more than willing to print my articles because there's no one really saying what I'm saying out there. Even
Why?
Though there's a lot of people that
How come? Well, how come? How come guys like you and me are the rarity? Why?
Well, I think that if you question some of the science, or if you question, or if you back some of the scientists who are saying the opposite of what the media is saying, people will accuse you of being anti-science, of being a troglodyte. That there's an accepted narrative, and if you don't accept that, you're either stupid or you're evil. It's not an argument, but just a way of kind of insulting you. And I think most people, most people know that concussions are bad, and I don't think there are too many football coaches out there that are, acting as though, having bull in the ring or head-to-head hits or anything like that. Coaches care about kids. Parents care about kids. And I think the perception for people who are not within sort of the football community is that there are all these kind of Vince Lombardi imitators trying to, drive 11-year-olds to slam each other's heads into each other. And it's just not what I see on football fields. I think the perception from the anti-football people could be, cured and updated, or take your pick of word. If they were to be around a football team for a practice or two, they would. I think they would learn a lot.
Here's some things that have been distributed, printed, said as fact, and I want you to comment. Dr. Michael Arnold Gluck, quote, "It is not a widely disseminated, downloaded, or discussed fact that the average life expectancy for all football players, including all positions and backgrounds, is 55 years. Several insurers say it is 51 years. CBS Sports columnist Greg Doyle, who's been a guest on the show several times, said, quote, "The NFL is killing its players, literally leading them to an early grave." And in talking about the NFL looking to expand the season, he says, and now the NFL is trying to kill them even faster. He continued, "Players want to play, yes, but they want to enjoy their lives after football. Hard to enjoy all that money, all that fame when you're dead at 55. George Will explained in one of his columns, quote, "For all players who play 5 years or more, life expectancy is less than 60. For linemen, it is much less." And the Seattle Post intelligencers, Dan Raley, described professional football as, quote, "a violent sport characterized by startlingly low life expectancy rates, depending on playing position, of anywhere from 53 to 59 years old." Your thoughts on all of that?
Well, it's all wrong. I think Greg Doyle's comment about, not wanting to have an 18-game season, that's a respectable opinion. I don't think football's not like baseball. They can play 162 games of football a year, or even 18 might be a stretch. But the idea that these guys are dying young from football is just false. It's scientifically proven to be false because of the NIOSH study, the federal government study, of every player who played in the league from 1959 to 1988 who played in 5 or more NFL seasons, all the pension-vested players, and they found that they had dramatically reduced mortality rates. They died far fewer times than their peers in society. They died of lung cancer at dramatically reduced levels. They died of heart disease at reduced levels. And most surprising to particularly the folks in the media, and some people still don't believe it, but the findings on suicide, they expected to find, I think, 21 or 22 suicides based upon the prevailing rates amongst all those 3,500 players. Instead, they found 9 suicides. In other words, the suicide rate among NFL players is less than half of what it is amongst comparable men in society. And the impression that you would get from all the coverage, because Junior Seau's suicide, or Joe Van Belcher's suicide, or Dave Duerson's suicide, the impression that you get is that NFL players are just dropping like flies. They're killing themselves like it's an epidemic or something. But the reality is that they're doing it far less than people in society.
Let's go to another phone call here off the second hour, a lot of them to get to. Give me Steve in Philadelphia on line 4. Steve, welcome to the Dino Costa Show with the book author Daniel J. Flynn. Hi.
Dino, how you doing?
Hi.
By the way, actually, I'm from Bethlehem, and Chuck Bednarik lives in my neighborhood, actually.
Oh, Chuck Bednarik died, 15, 20 years ago?
No, Chuck Bednarik, exactly. Chuck Bednarik walks around and does speeches at all the community Rotary things in our neighborhood. So, anyway, based on the NIOSH study, the fact of the matter is it's a long explanation when you explain science, and this gets back to your common sense comment, a half hour ago. I mean, based on the NIOSH studies, people would look at the numbers, and they actually looked at the numbers. They banned crab fishing, so kids couldn't learn how to fish because the ultimate crab fishing is probably the deadliest profession in the U.S. at this time.
Well, yeah, nobody says anything about that. I understand.
Yeah, I know, but nobody says anything. Well, you can't learn to fish when you're a Pop Warner kid, and then you learn how to surf fish when you're a little older and go out in the ocean a little older and stop the whole industry because, the fact of the matter is fishing out as a profession is probably one of the deadliest professions you can actually be in.
Agreed. And thanks for your call, Steve. Page 105 of your book, Daniel, the notion that NFL player life expectancy falls short of 60 is as widespread as it is false. Now, we just talked about that caller just dropped the name Chuck Bednarik, who was involved in one of the most vicious hits in NFL history, the hit that you referenced in the first hour concerning Frank Gifford. He's walking around with all of his capacities as best we know. But this continued falsehood that NFL player life expectancy falls short of 60 is widespread, yet it is continued to be reported on like that. You mentioned that talking heads say it loud, they say it often, but they say it without any basis. And I'm wondering, I'll talk out loud about it, refuting it. You do in your book, but nobody else does. Again, how can people make substantial claims like this without having the data to back themselves up?
What was amazing to me was that after the NIOSH study came out, in this January, there was a $100 million pledge from the NFL Players Association to Harvard University to study players, to give them medical care, to do a whole assortment of things. And in the release touting this pledge of $100 million, a doctor at Harvard cited the life expectancy rates of players of being several decades before the life expectancy of your average American male. And so it's not just that people said this before the NIOSH study. After they came out with the science, they're still repeating this. The NFL Players Association is still repeating it. George Will repeated it. Malcolm Gladwell repeated it after the NIOSH study came out. And so, these are the same people that will shout science and say, well, you're not accepting the science if you don't buy into their speculation regarding CTE. But when it comes to real science, like these NIOSH scientists, the study that they conducted, they're just ignoring it because it doesn't suit their agenda.
Okay, so if the NFL is in position of the same facts that you and I are, where's the NFL defending its damn sport? Like you do, like I do. Where are they?
Well, I'm hoping that you start seeing that this season. I'm hoping
what would lead you to believe that the NFL is prepared in any way, shape, or form to do like you and I are doing when just last week they fined a kid from the Chicago Bears $21,000 for making a tremendous and legal hit?
Yeah, it is getting it's getting a little bit strange on the football field, particularly for defensive players, because they don't. I guess my problem with a lot of the fines is that anytime you have a rule that's not really promulgated, a rule that's I'll put it like this. Anytime you have a rule that you can't really interpret, if everyone knows that you can't murder someone, and you know the penalty for murdering someone, but for some of these hits, there doesn't seem to be a clear-cut rule of what's legal and what's illegal, and sometimes what's illegal deemed by the referees is just a real hard hit. It looks bad, so they throw the flag. And I don't know that a hard hit should be fined in the NFL. I think it should be cheered if it's a legal hit.
Well, it clearly was a legal hit. There is nothing which tells me that the NFL is ready to defend its sport. And this is the part that chafes at me more than anything. You say celebrate the sport. Certainly, absolutely. That's all part and parcel of this whole thing. Celebrate it. There's nothing wrong with hard hits. It's what football's supposed to be all about. But you don't have anyone. The NFL is aware of all of these facts and figures that are in your book. And yet the people that are close to the NFL, media royalty, if you will, to the NFL, Peter King and others, continue to cite the statistics which are wrong, which you refute correctly in your book. You would think that the NFL would be admonishing these reports, admonishing these people who continue to trumpet misguided information, and yet they don't do it. They don't do it.
One of the things I did for the book is I intentionally didn't have any contact with anyone for the NFL because I didn't want anyone to say, this guy's a shield for the NFL. I wanted to be free to criticize the NFL and praise the NFL when they deserve praise and criticize them when they deserve criticism. Since the book has come out, I've been contacted by a number of people from the NFL, and from what I hear, the book's quite popular amongst some of the folks working for the NFL. So I don't know if they're just trying to flatter me, or if there's some truth behind that. But if it is popular, I hope it gives them the idea to start defending their game vigorously, or at least maybe give me a platform to defend it for them. But I think there's some great players. Deion Sanders is an example. He caught a lot of heat prior to the Super Bowl by, basically suggesting that the lawsuit by the retired players, that for a lot of players it was just a money grab. And, of course, I'm sure he lost a lot of friends over that because a third of living NFL players is suing the league. But guys like Deion defending the sport, they've been few and far between. And, can you imagine 20 years ago that we would be saying, Deion Sanders is now the voice of reason, but he really has been the voice of reason on this issue.
Well, hell yes, he is. Page 110, the San Diego Union Tribune reported that Junior Seau, let's bring his name up again, drank heavily at least 5 or 6 days a week, according to some of his friends. He gambled excessively in Las Vegas, San Diego area casinos, on the golf course, and in local San Diego card games. He had an insatiable appetite for women, especially those in their 20s, yada, yada, yada. Seau relied on Ambien and other aids to fall asleep for just 3 or 4 hours a night. Autopsy found no alcohol but traces of 4 prescribed drugs in his bloodstream. Despite earning nearly $60 million during his career, Seau experienced financial problems. Several of the eateries he invested in hemorrhaged money. San Diego Seau's, the restaurant, for instance, closed within 2 weeks of his death. So naturally, of course, spectators linked the spectacle they saw with the sorrow that they didn't. And Junior Seau killed himself, of course, because he couldn't deal with the after effects of his football career.
We'll never know why Junior Seau killed himself because he's dead and he can't tell us. But there's a lot of people out there that will tell you that he killed himself because of football. And I don't buy it. I mean, a year before Junior Seau's death, he drove his car off a cliff. There's all sorts of things that players do in their life, independent of football, where they can get damage, and not just brain damage, but all sorts of damage. If you drink 5 or 6 nights a week, if you're divorced, if you have, you're running around with girls half your age, a different girl every night of the week, you gamble a lot, you have an unstable lifestyle, all of those things can lead to suicide. They're all things that can send people into depression. And to ignore all that and just highlight football, I think is doing a disservice to reality, because what we know about Junior Seau is that he had all sorts of problems, including money problems, gambling problems, drinking problems, women problems. But the only problem that we highlight when we talk about his suicide is the football problem.
Back to the phones, and we go to Indianapolis. That's where Eric is. He's on the Dino Costa Show with book author Daniel J. Flynn. Hi, Eric.
Yeah, hi. I really appreciate you having Mr. Flynn on. I guess I had several questions. I work in the medical field and played Big Ten football. So, I kind of have a little different take on this maybe. As I've watched this thing play out, one of the things I'm very curious about is why no one has addressed the fact that goes on in the NFL where you see guys leaving their chin strap unstrapped. In particular, the other thing would be interesting to look at is that the current rate of concussions amongst people that, I remember when I played, I think the 4-point chin strap came with a Vikey helmet. That was the first time that was available or whatever. And now you see guys that don't even buckle 2 of the snaps, and it's cool to kind of, this fad to take that extra risk. And I never hear that being addressed. And in particular, the other thing, Daniel, I'd like to hear your thought on is if you looked into any more data that looked at who is currently getting concussions as we move forward. Because one of the things I've noticed is that, the guys with the huge amount of braided hair, it's almost like they can leave their helmet completely unstrapped and take any amount of hit and don't seem to get concussions. And I wonder if that extra padding or whatever is help protecting their brain in some way, shape, or form.
Thanks for your call, Eric. Dan, what do you think?
Well, the NFL had 170 concussions last year, and that was down significantly from the previous season. And the previous season before that, that was down from that season, although it was just a little bit. In looking at the history of football, and just to move away from concussions for a second, but one of the things that the NFL has done, which I think has been the emphasis has been wrong, and actually football in general, is that most of the penalties with regard to hits have been to defensive players, and the focus on concussions and all these other injuries is on preventing defensive players from doing X, Y, or Z. The defensive players are constantly, portrayed as Darth Vader figures, and they've got to protect the Bambi-like offensive players like the quarterback. But if you look at the statistics over the last 80 or so years with regard to catastrophic injuries, with regard to deaths in football, overwhelmingly the players that are getting hurt are defensive players, are special teams players, not so much offensive players. In other words, we're protecting the offensive players when, in fact, the guys who really need protection are the defensive players. And I think that's a big misconception that a lot of fans don't understand, is that the guys getting the concussions often and the guys getting, the guys getting hurt are defensive players. I think for the concussions, they tend to happen to the skill position players because they're going faster. And those are the players that are tending to get more concussions. And in fact, not every bit of news about football is good. When the NIOSH scientists looked at various neurodegenerative diseases, they found that these NFL players had a 3 times rate of death from these neurodegenerative diseases. Now, some of this is a little bit misleading because for Parkinson's, there was 2 NFL players out of that 3,500 pool that died of Parkinson's, and the prevailing rate was 1, so they had double the rate of Parkinson's. But that, to me, the numbers are so small that they're meaningless. But nevertheless, they have elevated rates of neurodegenerative diseases, and so I think you can say that if a guy plays football from Pup Warner all through professional league and plays many years in the professional league, if he's a skill position player at least, he does have an added risk of having some type of brain disease later. But the numbers are so small that I think all these other benefits to football, these health benefits particularly, outweigh them.
Well, and when you talk about the health benefits and when you cite statistics in the face of propaganda and that the average NFL football player does exceed the life expectancy of the average man out there in some other occupation, not everyone is, despite the evidence that is before them, is willing to believe it. One is Joe DeLamielleure, who was the offensive lineman with the Buffalo Bills, part of the Electric Company when O.J. Simpson was running up there in the 1970s. And he says, I think all of this stuff is bogus. He says, just, don't tell me that we live longer. He says, I don't believe it. So and what I want to know is this: do you know if Joe DeLamielleure is part of the class action lawsuit?
I believe he is.
Oh, well, what a surprise! What are your comments to somebody like Joe DeLamielleure who says, "Hey, don't give me the statistics. I know we don't live longer."
Well, he has been an activist in the NFL Players Association for a long time, and I believe he's been a critic of another guard, Gene Upshaw, the late Gene Upshaw. He's very critical of him, and so a lot of these players, I think for them, the lawsuit is sort of the negotiating table by other means. What they didn't win in the strikes, the concessions that they didn't win from owners, at the negotiating table in the labor stoppages, particularly the ones in the 1980s. They want to win in a lawsuit. And I'm sympathetic to some of the NFL veterans that say, look, we're getting a raw deal by the NFL. We don't get the pensions or the benefits that, say, Major League Baseball players get or players in some of the other major league sports. I get that. And probably the NFL should be better to those guys than they are. But the way to win those concessions, I don't think, is through a lawsuit. And I view the lawsuit as essentially kind of a union tactic by other means. I'm just not buying that a third of all living former NFL players are suffering from brain damage that they got in the NFL.
No, on the contrary. And you would think that everyone who plays football for any appreciable period of time is subjected to the risks of CTE or any other kind of brain trauma that could lead to other stuff, Parkinson's or whatever. It's ridiculous. I said this, I make this claim all the time. If you took every single player since the whole thing began back in 1920, put them in the biggest room imaginable, okay, and then scooped off the top the amount of players who played any appreciable amount of time in the NFL who, after their playing careers had ended, had suffered from debilitating injuries of one kind or another that really impacted and affected their ability to lead a normal life after they were done playing football. Every player from 1920 until this second in one room, scoop off the percentage of players who would fit the criteria I just said. The percentage would be microscopic, and yet the media continues to point to football as a death sentence. And what is more discouraging to me than anything are the vast amount of those who have covered the NFL for a long time, well-known names, respected, credible names in the sport who have covered the sport from a media standpoint, Daniel, and they themselves are taking part in the anti-propaganda war on the industry of football. It boggles my mind.
Sure. I mean, a guy like Frank DeFord, I mean, I know he's not associated with football, but he called football barbaric in a recent column. And, I mean, I remember Frank DeFord, I mean, what he used to hang around boxing matches and things like that in the 70s.
I think so, yeah.
That's what I remember Frank DeFord. Maybe I'm doing him an injustice there, but there's a lot of guys out there that are sports guys. Bob Costas would be one of them. Not necessarily football guys that, I don't think they're giving football a fair shake. And then you look at some of the football guys and you wonder why they're not more vigorously defending the NFL. There is a television host, he sometimes radio host, who fills in for Dan Patrick. I think he writes for NBC. His name's escaping me, but
Mike Florio.
Yeah, Mike.
Oh, yeah, that's the biggest praise, the biggest propagandist, and the biggest water carrier for this agenda that is out there.
Well, maybe I read something by him that was good, but that was, I think it was Florio, or maybe I'm mistaken. But there was one that I came across recently, and I thought, well, gee, why don't we have more of these guys? Why isn't Peter King saying this? Why aren't there more of these football reporters that are out there defending the game? I just think there's an inherent bias in sports journalism to sort of be adversarial towards maybe the league and stick it to the man and all that kind of thing, and be pro player, because after all, with regard to the players, and the players are all the retired ones are suing the league, they don't want to alienate the players, these reporters, because those are their sources, those are the guys they go to for quotes, and so naturally, if they start, if it seems like they're too pro NFL or too pro football, they might alienate some of those people. That could be at play.
Go get this book, folks. The War on Football: Saving America's Game. It is an eye opener. I'm hoping it's going to be the first thing in a game changing sort of a sequence over the next several months and years ahead. It ought to be, because here is factual evidence that this game is not the death sentence and is not the sport which kills people every day and leads to all kinds of brain problems and dementia and Parkinson's and CTE and all that stuff. In fact, football does a body good. We'll talk about that as we continue along the way here with Daniel J. Flynn. Let's go to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Mario on line one is on the Dino Costa Show with book author Daniel Flynn. Hi, Mario.
Hi. Good evening, Dan. Let me just say I think I welcome this as an absolute privilege and opportunity to reach out and talk to you, because Dino in recent weeks has really sold your book hard, and I'm highly intrigued on reading it. I have yet to obtain a copy, but there are 2 points I'd like to make. First of all, I don't think this could be released at a more sort of appropriate time, given that just today I read an article in the New York Times about ESPN being told, literally dictated to by the NFL, to disassociate from partnering in that documentary with PBS, being critical of the NFL, or at least considering detrimental ramifications of the NFL game at large. And the point I'm trying to make, sorry to pontificate here, but I gravitate toward honesty, and it just seems like you are pulling back. What it is you have to say about the NFL is refreshing, in that so many people, one way or the other, are being repressed from.
Mario, if I can interject here real quick, I'm interested in what you just said. I don't know if Daniel got that. You feel during this conversation that the author that is on the line with me with this incredible book is actually pulling his punches.
No, none whatsoever. I'm just trying to say that the release of this book could not be coming at a more significant time, because we're seeing evidence of the fact that the NFL, if they had the ability to suppress this book, they would and could, but then they're not in that position.
Okay, I thought you said that. I thought that you said that Dan is holding back. I'm sorry.
Oh, absolutely not, without a doubt.
Okay.
Would you not agree that if the NFL had the opportunity, they would suppress the publishing of this book, Dan?
Oh, I don't think they would suppress the book. With regard to the documentary, I haven't seen that documentary, but I'm a bit disturbed because the work that ESPN and FLYNN did, counting up the concussions the last few years, that was very helpful in writing the book. It was very good to see a gauge. Now, concussion counts can be, they can be kind of useless because not everyone's reporting the concussions. And I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but, in 2012, there were a couple of concussion studies, or there were a number, but one of them said that every year we have about 300,000 sports-related concussions. The other one said every year we have up to 3.8 million sports-related concussions. So they have their count. They don't even have their count straight by a factor of 12. And we're supposed to assume that that they've got a beat on this. And ESPN and FLYNN, I think, have done great work with the concussions and at least attempting to try to count them in the NFL, however inaccurate their counts may be. I don't know enough about the documentary to say whether it's a good documentary or a bad documentary. I do know that ESPN has about $1 billion invested in the NFL, and I don't know what went on behind the scenes. It's always disturbing to me when some big corporate behemoth bullies someone into pulling a documentary or something like that. I think the documentary is still going to get shown. It's just not going to be sponsored by ESPN. So I'll have to wait and see the documentary before I can pass judgment on it. But the circumstances of what happened don't really sit well with me.
Well, hold on a second, though. Maybe now I'm a little confused. Did I not hear you just say that you don't feel that the NFL, if they had the opportunity to suppress the publishing of this book, they wouldn't act upon that? I mean, it just seems what you're trying to say within this book, from what I've understood, is attacking the NFL. And it does seem like they actively take a role in trying to defend themselves in every way possible.
Well, I think the book at times is critical of the NFL. At times it's in praise of the NFL. Really what the book is about football. There are 4 million Americans who play tackle football, and to give you an understanding of the football demographic, about 1 out of every football players can legally buy alcohol. In other words, football is a kid's game. And we get the impression, because the football that we watch is football played by giant men in huge stadiums, we get the impression that football is a man's game. But there's just a very tiny fraction of the football population that's playing are adults, are playing in the NFL. Most of the people playing football are kids. And what my book is really about is a defense of football, not any particular league of football, not the NCAA, not NFL, but it's a defense of football.
Well, listen, ultimately I'll read the book and make my own opinions, but from the way it's been presented to Dino, a substantial amount of what you're saying within this book is something that is just not what the NFL wants spread. But listen, on a quick final note, let me ask you a question. Just given my circumstances, I'm fully capable of reading, but I'm someone that, for the most part, I listen to audiobooks. Is this book, has it already gone into production to be available on audio?
It has not.
Okay, now let me ask you a question. I've listened in recent weeks to Dino read upwards of 20 pages of your book. Is it possible can you play an active role? I mean, this is a book. You're the author. Who better than Dino? I mean, I've listened to probably in the past 5 years 100 audiobooks, and I'll tell you, what's going to make me read your book as opposed to listen to it? And maybe as an author, you'd before I buy the book. I don't know how you make more money, but the second I sample a book being read by someone that is ill-equipped to sort of convey the proper emotion and convey the essence of the book, if the wrong narrator is employed, it's a loss for me. So I don't know where you're at. Maybe they've already reached out to someone, but if you could play an active role in getting Dino to read this book, I'll guarantee that at the very least I'll buy the audio book, and I'll probably buy it in written form too. So whatever, I'll get off the air. I've taken enough time, but I look forward either to listening to your book or reading it. Take care, Dan. So.
Thanks a lot, Mario. I tell you, Dan, if you have not selected somebody to read this book, I would do it in a heartbeat because I believe in it passionately, and I believe that more people need to read it or hear it. It's interesting. Mario serving as my agent there.
And we know that people like to hear your voice a whole lot than they like to hear mine because you get a radio show and you get a listenership. So maybe Mario's on to something.
Well, I'll get your contact information before we let you go, and we'll see what we can do. Do you believe, and I say this for lack of a better way to say it in the moment here, do you believe in the pussification of the young American male, the emasculation of boyhood? I'm not certain how old you are. I'm 50. I remember my childhood very well. I can tell you that kids back then, for a number of reasons, were different than they are in their the stages of their development today. But do you believe that boys are being emasculated and there is this rather pussification in America that's going on? And does it relate to some of the subject matter that we talk about here when we talk about the issues and the items of what we're talking about here as far as football is concerned?
I have a 7-year-old boy, and one of the things I notice about boys is they have a lot of energy. When I come home, he'll jump on me, wrestle, jump around. Sometimes he's not even in control of himself. When I need energy, I'll drink a Red Bull or a Coke or something like that. But it seems that my son has just an endless amount of energy. And unfortunately, in America today, we take boys like that, we put them in front of screens, we have them play video games. They go out on with their friends. They do something called play dates, which I'd never heard of a play date when I was growing up. We just went out and hung out with our friends out in the neighborhood. You don't see kids organizing their own sporting events outside, like stickball or even like hide and go seek or touch football or anything like that. It's all organized by parents. And even when you see kids riding bikes in the neighborhood, it's almost like they have more equipment on than, a linebacker. It's something very strange has happened where we have really a bubble wrap society, and football clashes with that. I mean, let's face it, football doesn't really mesh well with our indoor, passive-aggressive, antiseptic society. It's an outdoor, muddy, rough game, and our society is none of those things. And so naturally, there is going to be an uproar against it because it really doesn't meld with the way things are going in 21st century America.
Does my memory serve me right here? 1968, was that a year in which you had a lot of deaths on the gridiron in college football, high school football?
Yeah, I mean, you had a lot of deaths everywhere with political assassinations to bombings on campuses to Vietnam, and on the football field was no different. There were 36 deaths at all levels of competition. Okay, let me stop you there. Now, that was right before Super Bowl III. Okay, they were during the year of Super Bowl III. You have all these deaths. Okay, yeah, this is the age of Bear Bryant back then at Alabama. Okay, you've got Joe Willie and the Jets going up against Johnny Unitas, or in that game Earl Morrow and the Colts. But I'm wondering where the outcry was. I've gone back. I've tried to look at several things online, pointing to incredible acts of backlash concerning the industry of football back in 1968. 30-some-odd deaths on all levels. I can't find it, Daniel. I wonder could you imagine the number of deaths on a football field 1968 taking place in the year 2013 and what the backlash and the outrage would have been? I ask you for your own opinion here. What was different in the mind and in the mentality of the American citizen or the sports fan in 1968 that has seemed to fly out the window here in 2013? Well, I think the country was getting to become a more brutal place at that point anyways, just as we sort of approached the 70s. There was obviously a difference between, say, 1958 and 1968, and that it got more accelerated as we got deeper into the 70s. And obviously in 68, you had students bombing banks and bombing campuses. You had MLK and RFK assassinated. It was the deadliest year for the American soldier in Vietnam. So there was all this carnage going around that I don't know that people were taking the time to realize what was going on America's football fields. There were some people who did realize, they started NOCSI, which is the football helmet standardization group that inspects football helmets. That came about after the 68 season because of it. The spearing penalties, the prohibitions on spearing, which started in 1970, 71 in the NCAA, that was a reaction to it. But there was no real movement to ban football. If that's what you're asking, and that's the point you're bringing up. There was nobody after 1968 saying let's get rid of football, even though it was a heck of a lot more brutal than it is now.
You're right, and I think you need to state with emphasis again, because people might think that you're trying to pull one over on them. Your research has showed you that football, circa 2013, right now, and going forward, we have no reason to believe that it's going to become any less safe. Football right now to play is safer than at any point in the game's history. Correct?
That's true.
So much great stuff in this book. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, well, I think a lot of people try to divert the conversation away from catastrophic injuries and away from deaths because they happen so infrequently now, and they want to drift the conversation towards CTE. And I think the reason they want to have the conversation on CTE is because it's all about speculation. We have a few autopsies that show CTE in a few dozen football players, but beyond that, we don't know a whole lot about it. So once you accept the invitation to have that discussion of CTE, it's just all speculation. And someone could make the remark that everyone's going to get CTE or no one's going to get CTE. We just don't know. The science isn't there yet. There's yet to be a randomized study on CTE in football or CTE in contact sports. And because there's no randomized study, we can't say with any degree of certainty the extent to which trauma causes CTE, to the extent to which CTE is different from, say, Alzheimer's. We just don't know the answer to these questions.
Would you be in agreement with me and others who feel like I do, based upon the continued attack and assault on the game, tearing it down, the hype, the hyperbole, the alarmist mentality that surrounds it, the fear tactics that are used, the guilt issue that comes into play, the way that the NFL is dealing, not, in my opinion, in a very productive or positive way with all of this, as you glean all of your research up to this point, Dan, and you look at all the things in your book, would you agree with me that the game does not portend to be a game that, say, 5, 10, 15, and 20 years down the road is going to be anywhere near as popular as it might be right now, and thus, as the result of that the ledger sheet, which looks very good right now, also will not look as good 15, 20 years down the road? Would you go so far as to say that?
One of the reasons why football is popular is because of the hitting, because it's a violent game, because it's a rough game. Cheers that greet a quarterback sack or just some defensive player depleting an offensive player, they are the same type of cheers when you hear a team score a touchdown, and sometimes the cheers are even greater for that. So the appeal of football for a lot of people is its roughness. And if you strip the game entirely of its roughness, if football became a flag football league, no one would watch. No one would come to the stadium. And that's part of football's appeal. I don't think there are people who are sadists out there that want to see more injuries and players getting serious neurological injuries or anything like that. Whatever we can do to protect them, let's do it. But the idea that we're going to make football tiddlywinks and we're going to think it's still going to be popular, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. So many great titles to chapters in this book: Concussions, Inc., Show Me the Money, Chapter 8, The Abolition of Boys, Chapter 9, Football Brings Us Together, Chapter 7, There Is Crying in Football, and Chapter 6, which we're going to discuss after this quick timeout, Football Does a Body Good. And we'll roll in your final phone calls if you want to get in. This is your last opportunity as I head into a final segment with the author of this terrific book, The War on Football, Saving America's Game, Daniel J. Flynn. The Dino Costa Show continues right after this. All right, hitting the home stretch with book author Daniel J. Flynn. Folks, this weekend, on your trails, wherever you go, make sure you get this book, The War on Football. I promise you will not be able to put it down. The War on Football, Saving America's Game. I have referred to it as the most important book written on football in the last 25 years, maybe ever, especially considering the crisis, the culture crisis that football is going through right now. It is 16 minutes to the hour. You want Daniel Flynn, and you want to ask him a question. Add something. Now is your final chance. 888-MAD-DOG-6, 888-623-3646. I think Chapter 6, Dan, and some people would, especially those who have bought into the hype concerning the negative aspects of football, would recoil once they open up your book and see that you've got a chapter here that says football does a body good. What, are you out of your mind?
Yeah, running up and down a field for 48 minutes, or, jumping up and down trying to catch passes, wrestling with other, 300-pound men on the line of scrimmage, all of these things have a beneficial health effect for you, for men, for boys. Not only that, but if you think about what goes on in the so-called off-season, there really isn't an off-season in football. These guys are in the weight room. They're on the track. They might be doing CrossFit. They're doing all sorts of activities to stay in shape for the season, because they even to be a starter on a halfway decent high school team, you've got to be in excellent physical condition. And the habits that these players are forming in high school, in college, or even at the Pop Warner level, sometimes they are, they last a lifetime. Sometimes they don't. You see some football players who, look like they haven't missed too many meals. But, for a lot of these guys, these habits are, these things, the sports, the athletics, all that is habit forming.
What do you mean when you say in the book here? I think I do know what you mean, but I'm hopeful that you'll expand upon this. You ask on page 139, what kind of men do parents hope their boys become? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that the way that boys are treated right now and the way that they're raised, they're not necessarily being raised to become men. And I talk a bit in the book about Theodore Roosevelt's son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. And when Theodore Roosevelt Jr. played on the freshman football team at Harvard, he broke his nose, he hurt his ankle, he got a bad cut in a practice at one point, and all of these injuries, even a cut, they made headlines. People saying, what is this kid doing out in the football field? He's the president's son. And the president, of course, loved football more than any other sport. Theodore Roosevelt loved football. Now, when you look at a guy like Theodore Roosevelt Jr., and you see the kind of man he became because of the rough, manly sports he played as a boy, it's just incredible. He is one of the greatest heroes in American history. He is someone that on D-Day, he was not only the oldest man to fight at Normandy on the opening day of on D-Day,
right,
but he was also the only father-son duo with his son. That's the kind of man that football produces. That's the kind of man that some of these rough sports produce. And I see a decreasing number of those kind of men, as Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who, he never was much of a football player. He got knocked around a lot. But some of those rough lessons on the football field, they paved the way to greatness on the battlefield.
Well, I'll tell you, obviously, it goes without saying, there's so many things in your book that I find so thought-compelling and interesting, and something I didn't even know here. You put here that the levels of testosterone in American males have been falling rapidly for several decades. That's alarming as far as I'm concerned. And then when you talk about the boys in this country and the way that parents are trying to raise them into being men, you say that men will remain boys so long as parents forbid boys to be boys. And you also say that boyhood is not a medical illness that is cured by Ritalin or a social illness that is repealed through interdictions on traditional red-blooded folkways. It's an age to come of age, to develop from a child into a man. And you also say that why should we expect boys who fail at boyhood to be successful when they become men into manhood?
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy these days to find a bro, to find to find a dude. But to find a genuine man, I think if you talk to some women, they would tell you that a genuine man is hard to come by. A guy who's going to take care of his responsibilities, and is not going to be sitting around playing video games and smoking pot, as a lot of 20-somethings are doing, or living in their mom's basement, or take your pick on any of the activities by some of these young guys who aren't very motivated these days. And I think it's because we don't allow these boys to be boys when they actually are boys, that once they become men, they stayed boys because they wanted to engage in all that activity that they missed when they were kids.
You also, Kaplan, did we have Kathleen Parker on this show a couple weeks ago with that book she wrote? Was that her name? Kathleen?
I think it was, yeah.
Was it her? Because she Save the Males is the name of the book. And Daniel's got an excerpt. I'll get to a phone call or two here in a second. But you put here on page 141, Save the Males author Kathleen Parker notes, quote, the importance of fatherhood has been diminished along with other traditionally male roles of father, protector, and provider, which are increasingly viewed as regressive manifestations of an outmoded patriarchy. The exemplar of the modern male is the hairless, metrosexualized man and decorator boys who turn heterosexual slobs into perfumed ponies. And I was thrilled that you decided to add that in your book, Daniel. To Chicago, Illinois, USA. Here's Ken on the Dino Costa Show. Hi, Ken.
Hey, great show.
Hi.
So I played high school football back in the 70s, from 1970 to 1974. I have to be honest with you. 3 of the 4 years that I played, I was afraid because of the head collisions. The 1 year that I was not afraid of head collisions was my first year, 1970. We had the helmets with the pads on it. You guys probably know it as the Willie Lanier helmet that he wore throughout his NFL career. And I'm telling you, if they put those pads back on the helmets, the injuries would be decreased, almost 90%, I would believe. What do you guys think about that? Why is this never brought up?
Daniel?
Was it Don Beebe that used to wear a pad on his helmet, or was it
it was Mark Kelso, I believe.
Okay, I think there was a particular player on the Bills.
Right.
And there are a lot of people that share that opinion. Now, I don't know if there's any scientific studies for that, but there are a lot of people that share that opinion that having that pad on the outside would be very helpful. Now, I've never worn that pad. I don't even think I've ever played against a player in my limited time playing football that had one. So I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know that opinion, it's not like he's the only one that has it.
But can't you argue, when people talk about the evolution of helmets and other equipment, it's hard if the game is safer than ever before, I'd have to believe that, because I've seen, listen, I wore football equipment for the first time back in the 1970s. I've seen football equipment now versus then. Back then it was like Neanderthal-like stuff. The equipment, the helmet, everything is much more safer and advanced now than ever before. And I would expect technology to continue to bring us safer football equipment.
Yes, definitely. The one area that you're not going to be able to do a whole lot in is concussions because, after all, as many people have pointed out, that, if you wanted to have a helmet that prevented concussions, you'd have to put that helmet inside of the brain. You'd have to have that between the brain and the skull because
right.
It's that rattling around effect
right.
inside of the brain. And so no helmet's going to totally take that away. They can take some of the shock away and absorb some of that, but you're always going to have the brain shaking inside of the skull, and that's how concussions come about. And so there's not a football, there are football helmets that are marketed to say that they, help against concussions, but in reality, there's no football helmet that will ever be developed that will cure, to prevent concussions entirely.
Totally. Last thing for you, because we're running out of time here, Dan, and I can't thank you enough. What do you hope this book does? What do you hope to accomplish with this book in the end?
I hope it makes some parents who are on the fence about allowing their kids to play football to give in to their kids' wishes if that's what they want to do. I hope it makes people who love football be proud of the game once again, give them some arguments to be able to defend the game. And I hope that if someone just loves the game of football, they'll read my book because there are just so many great football stories in there. The way we've talked a lot about numbers today, but I think that gives sort of a misleading impression of the book. The book's really about people. It's about football players from just all sorts of different backgrounds, and their stories propel the overall narrative. The sort of some of the points I want to make. Those points are made through the stories of people. And so, if you like stories about football, hey, The War on Football is the book for you.
Dan, great job, and I thank you again. Hang on the line because Kaplan, my producer, wants to talk to you. But all the best with this book. If I can do anything to promote it even more so than I have, I will do so. Enjoy your weekend, and thanks for your time here on the show today.
Thank you so much.
Daniel J. Flynn with a very important book that should be must-read for everyone, the war on football, saving America's game. Go out and get it.